Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank AmCham for the kind invitation to take part in this panel discussion. It is very important to talk about the clinical trials. Since by talking about that, we will see what applied research provides to the patient. It is a field that is highly complex, requires scientific approach and various different functions. And all these are the topics of today's discussion. There are European countries, dear colleagues, that are very successful when it comes to clinical trials. One of these is Spain. Spain in 2024 had 930 clinical trials, possibly the highest number in Europe. It has also very strong participation in national trials. 28% of the approved trials are multinational ones, and the Spanish Center take part by 43% in all new trials of medicines in the European Union. So Spain is a good example with very good practices that we can look at and draw some useful conclusions that will allow our country to be on the map of clinical trials. Clinical trials have, of course, an obvious financial impact, and they can stimulate the pharma economy. And, of course, they are one of the sine qua non for the transfer of knowledge to the patients, and Greece has to be present. Our country needs to have the opportunity to take part in this global environment of clinical trials and clinical methods. Summarizing some of the basic factors that can guarantee success of clinical trials in Europe, I would say that the first is the effectiveness of the regulations. The countries that have complied with the European regulation or have optimized the processes of the assessment councils and code of ethics councils have better clinical trials. Moreover, effective infrastructure, hospitals, research centers, trained personnel, and spaces where trials can be performed are of utmost importance. Moreover, the collaboration between private and public sector, academia and industry can attract patients and ensure the preparedness of the countries by funding this whole process. Of course, the budget of the clinical trials and the speed of initiation of every process is something that is also very important. The access of big populations to multinational trials is another very important factor, and something else that we should take into account is the role of the patients' associations. So today, we have with us very experienced colleagues, and with them we are going to talk about the way that the country can overcome some basic problems that we have identified over the last few years in order to become a competitive and attractive country for clinical trials of international specifications. We have the president of EOF, the Organization for Medicines. Mr. President, you are very young. However, you have served as a vice president of the Medicines Organization. In your view, what are the necessary reforms in the operation of EOF in order to ensure the upgrade of our country in the field of clinical trials, apart from the reforms that have already been implemented during the last few years? Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to be here today. The truth is that we often have this discussion, and when one hears about the benefits of clinical trials, wonders why don't we have a more strong presence in this field? The system has several different difficulties, and there is also a problem in culture, I would say. You gave the example of Spain. You also said that we are not a big country, but unfortunately we don't have the clinical trials that we could have as a small country, and we have a long way to go. Of course, as you aptly said, we have made some significant steps. For example, we have in the National Organization for Medicines the Ethics Committee, which for the last 2 years works very effectively and very fast. So with regard to that, we have made significant headway. There is no backlog in the Committee of Ethics and Code of Conduct of the EOF. So we have actually made some steps in the right direction. Now, apart from that, I believe that it all comes down to culture. In EOF, we need to understand, just like the patients at the hospitals need to understand that clinical trials are something very useful for the country, for the industry, for the patients, for everyone. Something else that needs to happen is strengthen the EOF with a trained workforce, with experienced and permanent workforce, with people that want to assess files, to travel to Europe, to EMA, in order to have discussions with counterparts and foreign colleagues, in order for them to acquire the necessary knowledge and therefore help the country become a stronger player in the field of RMS. But in order to do that, we need first to resolve the problems of routine. My professors in the university used to say that first is routine, then education, and then work on the field. Routine right now is being improved. Of course, there are increased needs. We are now in the digital maturing of clinical trials. So if I had to put this in order, I would say first comes staffing, that is human resources, then training, culture, and digitization and consolidation of databases. I believe that those who are involved in this discussion are aware that there are platforms, central ones for the clinical trials, and we need to consolidate and unify all data. We need to ensure that the databases are interoperable, communicate with one another, and ensure a harmonious digital operation. Training is something that I think is very important, and of course, there are the working groups. The Ministry of Health has established a work group for clinical trials. We expect some amendments to take place, and by the way, EOF makes some recommendations to the ministry in order to come up with a joint ministerial decision that will change the regulations and the overall framework. And I believe that these are some of the basic things that need to happen inside EOF so that it can actually provide the contribution it can. I will agree, based on the experience I have with EOF, on the need to have permanent staff that will have a career inside EOF and not leave the organization. I believe that this is one of the basic things that you need to promote. Dear Thanos, you are a colleague, and we are very proud of you because you are on the very few clinicians in Greece that takes part as a principal clinical investigator in major international clinical trials. So for many years, you have acquired experience about what needs to happen in the country so that it can become competitive. What would you suggest based on the experience you have as a clinician, as an expert in clinical trials? What would you propose to the state, but also to other sectors that are involved in the clinical trials so that they can become more effective and more competitive? Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take part in this panel discussion next to distinguished colleagues. Let's start with a pharmaceutical company. Because, as we know, the largest number of clinical trials, and especially of phase 2 or 3, start by pharmaceutical companies. Let's say that we have a big pharmaceutical company that wishes to run a random clinical trial in order to get the approval for a drug. We know that the chances of this type of trials being implemented in the USA are very few. We know that the patients in the United States have easier access to novel drugs, so the percentage of the patients is very limited. So they turn to European countries or to major Asian countries in order to conduct the clinical trials. And just like the President said, one of the most important factors is the population of the country. This is something that they will look at. The second thing that the pharmaceutical companies take into account, and given that this drug needs to get the approval and then reimbursed, is the processes that prevail in every country. That is, for example, the existence of a high clawback and rebate is an impediment for pharmaceutical companies that wish to invest in a state, since there will be delays in the approval of the drugs, along with all these clawback-related problems. Something else that is very important is whether in a specific country they can find doctors, researchers, or teams of scientists that have knowledge of a specific disease. You gave the example of Spain. Spain has succeeded because it has created different networks for the different diseases. There is, for example, the myeloma Spanish team, with which 80 hospitals are affiliated, with different relations, of course, a different speed of operation. So there is a network, and all those who take part in this network know that there is the collaboration necessary, and also the pharmaceutical companies can be sure that they will have the number of patients they need, and they will have the researchers that are highly recognized, which means that once this trial is published, there will be widespread recognition. In Spain, for example, they can find easily a large number of patients. And they are ready to conduct a clinical trial, since there will also be the scientists who are widely recognized, and once the report is published, there will be recognition. Moreover, the centers of excellence play a very important role. One of the reasons for our success in the Alexandra Hospital is the fact that when it comes to specific diseases, for example, myeloma, myelofibrosis, and compact tumors, to be highly recognized. So the pharmaceutical company turns a blind eye with regard to the size of the country and asks for our assistance and contribution. And the other thing that would be highly useful when it comes to the participation of researchers is the possibility of having doctors working in the NHS to be more flexible in the way they use the resources. For example, the ELLOK in the universities have the possibility to recruit people in the context of the clinical trial programs. Then the reimbursements of the KA are given every 3 or 6 months. So it is more difficult for someone to be flexible or to have the necessary staffing. In order to have a clinical trial or many clinical trials, you need to have a team of data managers, nurse clinicians, nurse specialists, and you understand that the state cannot guarantee that. It is not the responsibility of the state to do it. The state needs to facilitate the processes. I would like to thank the president of EOF, because both as president but also as vice president in the past, he has accelerated the operation of the ethics committee in EOF. One of the problems that has emerged lately is that at the level of EMEA, all the states need to get the approval or even revisions of trials to go centrally. This is a major change that we need to take into account. Thank you very much, Thanos. I believe that one of the basic things that we can keep from your intervention is that not everyone can have credible and competitive clinical trials. The country needs to focus on specific fields of therapeutics where it has an advantage in terms of science, clinical science, so that it can be internationally competitive. Mr. Kapetanakis, we know one another since I have taken part in the scientific committee of the Federation. I mentioned previously that the participation of the patients' associations in the clinical trials globally is decisive, and it has changed the landscape both in the US and in Europe. what would you propose to the state so that these strong participation become more effective and ensure greater safety in the country?
Thank you so very much for the invitation to be here in this most important roundtable with these distinguished guests that this panel has, and I would like to thank you for the question. Clinical trials are the spine of medical progress. At the same time, so to speak, a bridge between innovation and unmet patients' medical needs. This is what clinical trials do in our heads, but a requirement for these clinical trials to succeed is to reflect the needs, the expectations, and the prospects of patients. As representatives of patients, we have said time and again that we want to have a more active and wide participation in the design of all clinical trials. And when this is taken into consideration and it starts from the planning and the design and the very first steps, we make an actual transition from designing drugs for the patients to designing drugs with the patients, which has many more chances of succeeding because really it will reflect the actual needs of those people and it will help make the clinical trials in a better way. The effect and the impact on the patients is well known. We know that. In practice, we have patients who can access treatments 5 or 10 years earlier than they would otherwise have. The chairman of the ELLOK and the professor already mentioned from their own perspective and under their own capacity in the role they have in the procedures and how patients may participate as well. I should like to say that we are concerned, and our concern is that Europe as a whole, and perhaps our country, approach clinical results in a phobic way and with a sense of guilt, unnecessarily so. There is an introversion. The procedures are much more closed than they should have. Knowing that between 2018 to 2023, the world over, or rather 70,000 people more than before were included in clinical trials, whereas at the same time the participations in Europe were reduced by 60,000. It appears that this new framework that was implemented maybe does not work as anticipated in a globalized economy and in a different perspective. We see countries leaving, going to Asia. And you mentioned the example of Spain, and earlier we heard about Belgium, which proved that initiatives undertaken and strategies implemented have helped this entire framework work better. So our perspective is that this is the way to view things differently. We shouldn't stick to the rationale of simply implementing a framework that I must implement, but we must be more creative. We must involve in these procedures the patients themselves more, both to discover, find new clinical trials and keep them going. We're a small country, okay, but we're talking about 160 billion available all over the world, 47 million that could be available in Greece, 92 million in Greece, 47 billion in Europe, 92 million in Greece. If we, the patients, have a role, an actual role, an institutional role, is something we need. We shouldn't be there just in paper. We should be more active as patients, and patients must be supported in doing that. You know, participating in these processes and procedures says that you must receive some training, you must receive some information. These things do not go without saying. These people want to participate, want to make the difference, but they need some support to do so in an effective and meaningful way. So in conclusion, I would say that yes, we must change our perspective, we must change our mind view, both in Europe and Greece, from this guilty stance we have, and move on to something more active. Follow the example of other countries, follow the example of other areas, and we're here to help. I don't think that there's a matter of safety anymore. We have a very important advantage as a country, an edge. We have brilliant scientific personnel. brilliant scientific staff who excel abroad. But there are some hindrances, some obstacles when someone is not willing to circulate some drugs in the country as their policy because of red tape, so you wouldn't be in their crosshairs if they're looking for places to perform and conduct clinical trials. Okay, this is a complex matter. We're here to help in any way we can and in any direction you may choose. Well, Mr. Kapetanakis, I think that the only way to get rid of this suspiciousness we have regarding clinical trials in our country especially, and being suspicious of the other is sort of a national sport. Okay, sometimes we tend to find and discover problems where there aren't any. I mean, the role of the Patients Association is a pivotal one, because this discussion will spring out from these communities, it will revolve around them, and it will make everything more convincing. Ms. Patel, Kavita, now you are managing director of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Roche, with great participation in the development of new treatments, both conventional and new treatments as well. You've performed many studies, carried out many studies the world over. As a company, what would you like to see in the Greek ecosystem that is related to clinical trials, so as to convince you to bring clinical trials in this country, or to help the country participate in multi-centric studies that are organized every year? Πρώτα απ' όλα θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω το Ελληνοαμερικανικό Επιμελητήριο για την ευκαιρία να κάνουμε αυτή την συζήτηση. Θεωρώ ότι είναι πολύ σημαντικό το θέμα. Θα ξεκινήσω λέγοντας ότι τι έχει η Ελλάδα. Κοιτώντας την Ελλάδα, αυτό που βλέπουμε είναι εξαιρετικούς ερευνητές, πάρα πολύ καλούς επιστήμονες, δραστήριες ενώσεις ασθενών σε κλινικές μελέτες. Μας βοηθούν από το σχεδιασμό μέχρι την εκτέλεση αυτών. Επομένως υπάρχουν πολλά καλά στοιχεία εδώ στην Ελλάδα. Εν τούτης υπάρχουν κάποιες περιοχές που επιδέχονται βελτίωση. Ως πολυεθνική εταιρεία υπάρχουν διάφοροι παράγοντες τους οποίους θα εξετάσουμε προκειμένου να λάβουμε την απόφαση σε ποια χώρα θα διεξαγάγουμε κλινική δοκιμή και που όχι. Πρώτα απ' όλα αναζητούμε ένα περιβάλλον το οποίο έχει μια ξεκάθαρη αναγνώριση της αξίας της καινοτομίας. Χρειαζόμαστε ένα περιβάλλον στο οποίο η καινοτομία αναγνωρίζεται. Και είμαστε πεπισμένοι ότι αμέσως μόλις ξεκινήσουμε την κλινική δοκιμή και δώσουμε ένα δοκιμαστικό φάρμακο σε ασθενείς και όταν αυτό ολοκληρωθεί η μελέτη και το φάρμακο εγκριθεί, θα μπορέσουμε να το διαθέσουμε σε όλους τους ασθενείς που το χρειάζονται στην εν λόγω χώρα. Θα ήταν ανήθικο για εμάς να βάλουμε ασθενείς σε μία μελέτη αν δεν είμαστε πεπισμένοι ότι θα μπορέσουμε να λανσάρουμε αυτό το φάρμακο για τους ασθενείς της χώρας αυτής, και πιστεύω ότι αυτό είναι το ένα θέμα. Και υπάρχουν πολλές ευκαιρίες που μπορούμε να χρησιμοποιήσουμε για να βελτιώσουμε το υφιστάμενο περιβάλλον στην Ελλάδα. Χρειαζόμαστε αυτή την προβλεψιμότητα, χρειαζόμαστε αυτή την αυτοπεποίθηση, αν θέλετε, και την εμπιστοσύνη ότι θα αναγνωριστεί η καινοτομία στην Ελλάδα. Η δεύτερη πτυχή είναι η ταχύτητα. Έτσι, ο ΕΟΦ έχει κάνει έχει βελτιώσει σημαντικά την ταχύτητα με την οποία μπορούν να στηθούν μελέτες. Από ό,τι είδαμε υπάρχουν προς το παρόν καθυστερήσεις και αυτό δημιουργεί καθυστέρηση στην συμπερίληψη των ασθενών και υπάρχουν ασθενείς οι οποίοι είναι έτοιμοι να συμπεριληφθούν, αλλά επειδή δεν έχει ολοκληρωθεί αυτό το κομμάτι χάνουν την ευκαιρία να μπουν σε μια κλινική δοκιμή. Ποια είναι η λύση εδώ? Και πραγματικά χαίρομαι που ακούω ότι έχουμε μια εθνική ψηφιακή πλατφόρμα όπου μπορούμε να υποβάλουμε όλες αυτές τις μελέτες και να πάρουμε ταχύτερα τις υποβολές αιτήσεων προκειμένου να τρέξουν αυτά τα site, αυτοί οι ιστότοποι. Θα πρέπει να τυποποιήσουμε τις διαδικασίες και επίσης να συνάψουμε συμφωνίες προκειμένου αυτά τα site, αυτοί οι ιστότοποι να λειτουργήσουν. Αυτό είναι το δεύτερο που είναι πολύ σημαντικό στοιχείο. Το τρίτο στο οποίο θα αναφερθώ, και νομίζω ότι η Ελλάδα είναι σε μοναδική θέση να επιταχύνει την θέση μας ως προς να βελτιώσει τη θέση της ως χώρα που προσελκύει κλινικές δοκιμές. Ξεκινήσαμε με το 2019 με το επενδυτικό clawback. Εν τούτης, αυτό που συνέβη το 2022-2023 είναι κάπου από τα 250 εκατομμύρια, μόλις 10 εκατομμύρια χρησιμοποιήθηκαν για να αποσβεστεί το κόστος των κλινικών μελετών και υπάρχει περιθώριο βελτίωσης. Είναι μια ευκαιρία να ξαναδούμε το πώς αντιμετωπίζουμε αυτό το clawback της επένδυσης, να υπάρχει μεγαλύτερο κομμάτι, τουλάχιστον το 15%. Και οι χορηγίες οι οποίες δίδονται από τις πολυεθνικές να αναγνωρίζεται και να συμπεριλαμβάνεται, να συνυπολογίζεται στο clawback. Και αυτά είναι τα στοιχεία, θεωρώ, που αν δράσουμε τώρα με την συγκεκριμένη γεωπολιτική περίσταση, μπορούμε να το εκμεταλλευτούμε, γιατί τώρα είναι που οι χώρες αποφασίζουν πού θα επενδύσουν και είναι η ευκαιρία για την Ελλάδα να εργαστεί τώρα προκειμένου να γίνει ένα παγκόσμιο hub στην διεξαγωγή κλινικών μελετών.
Thank you very much. One of the conclusions that I can draw from your intervention, and something that I have talked with colleagues abroad, is that Greece needs mentoring and training in this field of activities, and it is one of the responsibilities of the big companies to channel the influence they have so that the country can become the end user of new therapies, but also to take part in this whole process. Ms. Koraki, you know better than anyone how important technical support is for the realization of an effective clinical trial. It plays a decisive role, I would say. We know the big CROs that participate and support clinical trials in other countries. It is something that should exist in Greece as well. Where does our country stand with regard to that? The CROs that currently exist and have the capacity to support clinical trials in Greece, do they have this extroversion and this expertise that is required so that we can be effective and competitive globally? Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, both for the question and the invitation. It is a great pleasure to talk about clinical trials in conferences like this. I'm delighted that we are given the opportunity to touch upon different issues pertaining to clinical trials. I would like to focus on CROs and what can actually help our country become more competitive. We have all agreed that there is a multiplier of value in clinical trials. The patients have early access to novel drugs and to novel treatments that are not out there in the market. Economy grows because capital flows in, more jobs are created, the reputation of the medical community is enhanced. We use money in order to upgrade the equipment of hospitals. We have all agreed on all these, but if we want to maximize these benefits, we need to take a serious look at the way we can attract funds. We keep on hearing about the different numbers. We had heard that in 2023, 44 billion was spent on clinical trials, 35 billions, and Greece gets 200 clinical trials and these 250 millions. And all those who know about numbers like PwC say that Greece, which is 1.5% of the European population, needs to get 500 millions. This proves that in the past we were not that effective. Now we are slightly better, but there is room for improvement. And of course, there is this fierce competition at the same time. These 44-55 billion will be spent in Europe. The European countries will get them, and if we don't get them, the other countries will. So, clinical trial is indeed very important. It is highly regulated and has many and several stakeholders. So, if we want to make progress, we need political will. The state needs to realize the benefits, place the particular emphasis, give priority, promote PPPs, and collaboration in general between private and public sector, create a stable framework that will be attractive for clinical trials, improve any problems pertaining to delays and bureaucracies, evolve the regulatory framework, have sufficient workforce that it will work on a permanent basis. We don't want to train some people and see them leaving after some years. We need to develop what we call clinical culture. And last April, the Prime Minister said that we are very interested in clinical trials, and we were very glad to hear that. And he also said that it will be a priority of the national strategy for growth. And we heard all the things he said, and we were delighted with this. Then Mr. Georgiadis said that the second semester we will see a different landscape of clinical trials in Greece. And I believe that he was referring to the ministerial decision that will soon be amended, because the team of the ministry to which we referred previously has worked very hard, and we are expected to see the results of this hard work. We expect to see this decision that will simplify processes, will consolidate processes, will develop some standards for contracts, digital signing, many different things. Clinical trial is a field where there are different stakeholders, both inside the country and outside. And it requires collaboration with the authorities, the hospitals, the researchers, the patients, the CROs. The local dimension, that is our resources, our processes, the incentives we provide, and anything we do locally will define whether we are attractive or not, in order to attract investments, On the other hand, the international dimension, regulations, competition will influence our capacity to attract clinical trials. We will also be influenced by technology that is advancing rapidly, and we need to keep up with it. You know that we live in a fast-changing world. Technology creates a new landscape in clinical trials. International communities advancing. China has become first in discovery of new molecules. Europe, as you said previously, because to the adjustment to the new regulation, lost some clinical trials. Greece doesn't have the luxury to wait any longer. If we want the patients to have access to innovative treatments and drugs, and if we want to have a presence in the map of clinical trials, we need to speed up. Now, what will be the position of Greece on the map of clinical trials in the future will depend on the actions that we'll take now. And we talked about Spain. Okay, we can just follow the example of Spain. We don't need to do something unique. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to speed up and improve. Thank you very much. One of the things that we can see in our country, not only in the field of clinical trials, but generally, and given that we are lagging behind when it comes to technology, is that we are not very used in taking business risk. The state needs to ensure that there will be an allocation of business risk so that we can change the mentality overall. And, dear colleagues, this is exactly what plays a decisive role with regard to everything we talked about today. In universities, Thanos, funding is needed so that there can be the right infrastructure that will host this type of activities. When it comes to patients, the state needs to ensure that the patients' associations are well organized, that they have the administrative support they need so that they can take on these activities in a professional way. Moreover, if the international industry sees that our country, Ms. Patel, invests in this field, then it will turn its gaze on us and will help us, because after the last 20 years, the outsourcing that you have done, you don't have in-house many of the activities. You know that better than we do. There are indeed a lot of funds that can come in the country. And the same stands, Mr. Korakis, for the infrastructure, the CROs. You said it very aptly and very precisely. We have only a few minutes, dear colleagues, so I would like each of you to take 2-3 minutes and make a comment on what has been said by the other panelists, or to add a new idea, or to express an apprehension or anything. Thank you, Professor. Very briefly, I would like to say what we expect to happen in the coming years. I believe that if we improve the environment in EOF, if we improve the working conditions for the staff, and if we increase the number of permanent personnel, then I believe that the wider environment of drugs will be improved. Moreover, we are expecting to see the National Registry of medical and biological research that will help us put this multitude of data in order, and of course, then Greece will take part in the Increase Net, which is a joint action of the European Union. In the context of that, the bigger countries help smaller ones get the necessary training in assessing the different files. And by the way, I communicated with my German counterpart, and I know, based on this discussion, that this is also very useful for clinical trials. I was also in a meeting in Denmark, and there we saw that the clinical trials are being reduced in Europe in absolute numbers. We know that the clinical trials increase in other areas, but in Europe they are decreasing. So I believe that Greece has a lot of chances to grow in the coming months and years. Panos?
I believe that the state could essentially promote and create and promote centers of excellence, but in a substantial way, possibly by allow them to have more beds available. Now we have clinical trials on monoclonal antibodies, and we have the general on-call days, and we have to convince, and we did that, convince the administration that we'll need 3 beds to be left free for the patients who will come the day after. Now, unless this is recognized, acknowledged, or enhanced and supported by the state, no such trials are going to be made here in Greece. For instance, in France, each published paper, or rather each paper published by a hospital's doctor, is accompanied by a further subsidy by the state to the hospital. And this is something that happens in France in the past 50 years, regardless of who's in government. So there is the so-called good bureaucracy which administers and manages the public sector. There's the issue of clawback and rebate. Mrs. Patel mentioned it, I think. Why is it always that in Germany we see clinical trials in oncology activate first? Because they are the first state that as soon as the EMA approves a drug, it will be included in the reimbursement, setting aside the size of the state and the country. And these are some issues that are not resolved simply by saying that we decided to have clinical trials. As you said, this has little or no effect, that we decided to make clinical trials in the country. Okay, political will is there, but it requires specific actions to attract these clinical trials, and we hope to see them happen. Unfortunately, we haven't seen anything like this over the last many, many years. Mr. Kapetanakis. Well, I think that most of what was important was already mentioned in this roundtable. What I would like to say in conclusion is that for the patients, there is a stress, a concern as to whether they will find a clinical trial to participate in. And what we'll need to see through this framework, and I believe that the role of the EOF must be a fundamental one, and the EOF must assume a much larger role than it does now, and competencies and responsibilities. I believe that the state must enhance and support the EOF to perform their role freely and bring the much coveted results. Through our participation, the patient's participation, the leveraging of technology, the utilization thereof, what we want is for all patients to be given the possibility to participate in a clinical trial, if possible at all. Because, you know, our country has the center, the region, the islands. I'm not convinced that all patients everywhere in Greece have the same capacity and the same access. So through the utilization of technology, the fast-tracking and acceleration of processes and procedures, which is fundamental to do things much faster in predictable times that will be comparable to those that the people who make the clinical trials want. And this, combined with the scientific personnel we have, will lead us to a better day with centers of excellence and with utilization of all the available data. We're here to make it happen, to contribute from any aspect, from any job, from any position. We are allowed or we are proposed to assume or you feel crucial, critical or useful. I think there are many opportunities and we've seen this abroad. Ms. Patel? Μάλιστα. Λοιπόν, νομίζω ότι μπορούμε όλοι να συμφωνήσουμε στο γεγονός ότι οι κλινικές μελέτες είναι κεφαλαιόδους σημασίες στην καινοτομία και στην επιστημονική πρόοδο. Παρέχουν πολλαπλά ωφέλη για τους ασθενείς, για τους ιατρούς, τους ερευνητές και την οικονομία καθ' αυτή. Οι ασθενείς μπορούν να έχουν πρόσβαση σε ερευνητικά φάρμακα. Οι ερευνητές έχουν τη δυνατότητα να προαγάγουν την επιστήμη, να αποκτήσουν διεθνή αναγνώριση. Για την οικονομία προσελκύουν θέσεις εργασίας και επενδύσεις. Επομένως, ως πολυεθνική εταιρεία που δραστηριοποιείται στην Ελλάδα, είμαστε ενθουσιασμένοι με το τι μπορεί να κάνει η Ελλάδα για να γίνει περιφερειακό hub κλινικών μελετών και καινοτομίας. Και είμαστε όλοι εδώ για να μπορέσουμε να βοηθήσουμε στην επιτάχυνση αυτών των μεταρρυθμίσεων που συζητήσαμε σήμερα, προκειμένου να κάνουμε μια ουσιώδη αλλαγή με σημασία που θα βοηθήσει τους ασθενείς και την επιστήμη. Now, you asked me about the CROs. Now, the CROs are here to stay. They're represented, they do their job. But if we want to see actual and true progress, we must run. We must expedite the reforms of the legislative framework. We shouldn't keep them on hold or on standby for so long. We need to adapt legislation immediately. The lady talked about the CROs. I saw that Ms. Patel just put on her headphones. This is the interpreter. Talked about the CROs and the expediting the changes of legislation. We need to be fast. We need to have the personnel ready. We need to be modern to maintain an attractive environment, and we need to dash forward. We can no longer afford delays. Our researchers, who are indeed excellent and reputable, we must help them perform clinical trials. We must not raise obstacles and impediments. The state must realize, understand, and take all measures to improve the environment of clinical research. This is the only way we can claim a position in the global status quo. Right, I should like to thank everyone for their participation, thank the audience as well. And the results of this beautiful discussion we will publish. Please send your conclusions about a third of an A4 page, no more than a third of an A4 page, to publish it in the press. And it's our obligation to inform the general population, Mr. Chairman, for the importance of these activities. They shouldn't be just activities of Mr. Dimopoulos as a clinician and a doctor, but to have a wider impact for society. Thank you all very much for participating.